Hello there. So we're proceeding on with our assessment of the primary powers that govern over the human realm. This time by alternating over and beginning an assessment of the symbolic expressions that speak to our relationship to death. Now, I don't want to waste any time with this, I just want to get right into it. Death is rightfully one of the primary powers because it provides the hidden metric by which we qualify our lived experiences, even if we're not consciously aware of it. And it holds a subliminal sway over us like nothing else can. Death also represents the ultimate threshold where our time in this world closes, and this provocation has given rise to a myriad of different solutions that attempt to address the inevitable calamity of our earthly form. Though we are accustomed to talking about death in the singular, as it applies to our biological permanence, we could say, death operates most prominently at the level of the psyche. Once the burgeoning intelligence has been captured by the reality of its impermanence, our entire model of the world changes, and in innocence is lost forever. And if you're a parent, you'll know this very well, because when we first enter into the world as children, most of us are encapsulated for a short time within this field of innocence, where the savage nature of, well, nature isn't awarded to our senses just yet. But when it does, and that threshold is crossed, there can be no going back from that. We are now existing in a completely different arena of circumstance than where we were before, and our entire reality is refracted through a new prism that is omnipotent and all-encompassing, because its consequence closes around everything. And therefore, everything is now underpinned by the mark of that impermanence, our mortality, and the many faces of suffering that it yields. I remember when my grandfather died, when I think it was about 9 or something like that, and that was definitely one of these threshold events. Because even though my mind had already been acquainted conceptually with the notion of death, death happened to people, death happened to animals, things like that, we don't have a proper comprehension of its power until it affects us personally in some way, in some direct way. And I will say that after the death of my grandfather, lots of other things started to change in my life, and that event then accounted for a kind of linchpin moment that seemed to hold all of these things together. This is where we start to think about things in a more primitive way. That is, we see disembodied events occurring in a causal way to each other, and we develop a narrative sequence around them so that it represents something of a kind of quasi-personal mythology for us. We are doing what primitive peoples and all peoples have been doing ever since. We're world building, we are myth making, we are conjoining strands of seemingly disembodied events together into a new reality structure, and that reality structure aids in the process of reconciling our minds to the reality of our lived experiences. It doesn't matter whether or not the reality structure is objectively valid. What matters is that it serves a purpose that is as significant to us today as it was to our primitive ancestor back then. It heals emotional wounds. It affords us a sense of closure, and that closure allows us to then go about with the rest of our daily activity without the paralyzing anxiety that would be there without it. And so what we can take from this is that we know matters of life and we know that matters of death are intimately connected. One informs the other, and that one of the other consequences of being the kind of organism that we are is that due to the sophistication of our nervous systems and our brain's ability to run such complex algorithms about our experiences, is that we have to find ways to live with our capacity to be so sensitive and to exist not only in this reality, but as the complex creatures that we are. These universal consequences of simply being aware of it all and dealing with all that conscious life throws at us has to be addressed in some way. We can't simply look around at the world with this blasé attitude and say, oh, well, this is just the way that it happens. This is the evidence. This is just the way that it's always been. Because we're not that mundane as creatures, and we're not so psychologically linear to react in such a flitting way towards the life, which is itself not mundane or linear. The complexity of our organism is a byproduct of the complexities of life, and it consequentially generates a complex expression towards the realities of life. So our brain has to come up with ways that enable us to process the complex consequences of life and enable us to continue with the ongoing and often dramatic and painful process of living in this sensory experience. And this is where I think ritual process steps in. So now we've gone over some of the essentials that underpin the response to our mortality. Now I want to evidence that by looking at one of the earliest prime indications of our organism's mark upon the earth, namely burial practices. The burial of the dead, often in a ceremonious way, is one of the longest held practices of our species, and like so many of these primal things, we take their significance completely for granted. It should also be noted, especially to the minds of secular rationalists, that when we attend a funeral ceremony, regardless of our philosophical position, we are taking part in a ritual act. And that ritual act of burial is a primordial act, and it predates all philosophy and notions of civilization. Its evolutionary inheritance is so deeply buried within our psychological structure that we do not even have to believe in the god figures that accompany those kinds of rituals, because the primacy of the act reverberates so deeply to our vital experience. And it's our vital experience that is spoken to so powerfully by the realities of life and death that provokes us willingly into these styles of action. So what can we say about the earliest examples of this practice? Well, if we draw from the examples when this kind of thing was happening as far back as 30,000 years from where we are today, we see a lot of divergence in the quality of these burials. Some graves contain figures that are articulated, meaning that they're on their side or their limbs are in various positions, like they've simply been placed in the grave casually. And others show a more deliberate straightening of the figure on its back with the head facing upwards, like we arrange our dead today in modern coffins. This is the corpse posture that we're familiar with. We also notice a great deal of diversity with regards to the inclusion of additional objects that accompany the corpse, such as jars, jewelry, and arranged items that might have carried an additional symbolic significance. Remember that we still perform this ritual of ornating our corpses today with crucifixes around their neck or sometimes in the hands of the subject, and these signify a wider meaning around the burial of the dead that we're going to have to address. So, first off, if we take the most pragmatic approach to this and then build up from there, burying bodies in the earth actually possesses some sensible practicalities around it. Firstly, the sanitation side. We can observe that bodies decompose over time, and that attracts pests and animals and vermin, not to mention flies and the spread of contaminative agents that spill up from the body, and that could possibly contaminate a water supply or increase the chances of contracting disease. So there are very real practical reasons for burying bodies that we have to consider. Also, the sensory problems of the sight and the smell of decomposing bodies is not something that most human beings want to be exposed to for obvious reasons, but also because the visceral sight of a corpse undergoing decay reminds us, I think, of the impermanence of our own existence in a much more telling way than even a fresh cadaver can, because it conveys that image of process of the body's breakdown and disintegration, and the image of decay is a very vivid representation of what is already happening to us right now, if you think about it. If you've seen that artist, I don't know if you've seen him, who he took a photograph every year of their life and then kind of montaged it in a video, and you'll see the real effect of actually what's happening right now. We are degrading and changing in slow motion. And that's not to mention the literal genocides that go on the surface of your skin and on a daily basis. Millions of tiny organisms being blasted out of existence and returning every single day on the surface of a living body that might as well be a universe to them. You know, it puts things in perspective, I suppose. Anyways, the practical reasons for burying bodies underneath the earth and out of harm's way is a very reasonable thing. But what of all of this ornamentation? What about all of this ceremony that is being lavished onto these bodies? We can't simply leave this alone with a pragmatic solution, because there's a lot more here than meets the eye. So to understand this, we have to think about the evolutionary implications. For millions of years, this planet had seen legions of organisms, microbial and waterbound for a long period, then developing into more complex systems, the age of reptiles, the Great Ice Age, and this great branching out of all of these different spreads from a similar pattern, a similar design, a common archetype, if we have to call it that. And then we get to a period where something very odd starts to happen in the animal kingdom. Strange marks begin to appear in the environment. Arrangements of things in an order that were previously disembodied and remote begin to appear in the natural landscape. And from these deposits of specialized action, we get the first historical impressions of a totally different breed of creature that has stepped into the evolutionary arena. One that possesses the unique ability to codify the impressions of its sensory experience into the world as frozen deposits of that experience. And this is where we get to what I like to call the primal trinity. Cave painting, burial practice, and most significantly, the implied conception of an alternative reality to the one afforded to us by our senses. And that last feature is what I really want to hone in on here. These powers of our vital experience in life and death are existentially prominent to all living creatures. Cats have it, wolves have it, spiders have it. But the profound ability to harness that and introspect upon its components, only to then export that internal apprehension into the world as an artifact, that is totally unique in the history of organic evolution. No other animal on Earth possesses that ability. Only we can take abstractions that began as inner perturbations of our nervous experience of life and then translate that into new modes of expression that encapsulate the core essentials of that experience, which then feed back into the organisms that made it and alter the way that it thinks about the world. And that reality, the reality of that, is totally depreciated in our modern experience, because we are so habituated into receiving expressions and talking about expressions and thinking about expressions in a purely intellectual way that we completely miss the primal actuality of what's actually happening to us. You ask any artist who uses this evolutionary talent that I just described all the time in their own practice, and they'll spark up and they'll start hallucinating about it, and they'll start conveying to you all kinds of sophisticated conceptions about their images. But ask the same artist how their images actually came into being and why it affects them so, and you'll be met by walls of stunned silence, because we all take the roots of the matter as given as the day, and therefore we don't ask so many questions about which we take as given. But we should, because there lies the root of the question. What kind of organism am I, and why do I do these things? The simplest questions lead to the greatest answers. Symbols of life and symbols of death are the prime symbols of our race, because they all speak to the heart of the issue for us. Not the philosophical, not the social, not the political, but the real essence of what shapes and determines our vital experience. And that's why we keep on producing them, and that's why we keep on being so profoundly affected by them, because beneath all of the noise and the complexity of the modern metropolis and its laws and its codes and its machinations on the world, we are still organisms with an organic instinct. And that instinct speaks to us about the most important parts about what we are and the world are shaped by. Birth, death, creation, extinction, over and over and over again. That is the primacy of our life's action, and the reality of death is the power that translates our inertia into the systems of creation that shape the human world.